Olga, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Olga and Caroline, for hosting me here, for being such great co-authors and collaborators on a joint paper. So that's the purpose of my visit. We're just trying to wrap up a paper and submit it. Thank you all for dedicating your lunchtime break to hearing me talk. I'm going to present something that's super new. You're the first ones to hear it. So you're the first ones to give me feedback, hopefully constructive and useful feedback, but I'm not very worried that this will not happen with all the experts in the room. And yeah, I'm looking forward to spending some more days here and meeting some of you maybe for lunch or for coffee or for just little chats. So it's been a super pleasant experience to be here so far, and I might be coming back in the future. All right, so what is my talk about? My talk is about family diversity and national comparative care context, and the question who is actually providing family care and who is providing non-family care in Europe. And this is, okay, I need to click forward, yeah. This is joint work together with two colleagues from the German Institute for Gerontology in Berlin, the DZA, namely Mareike Wünnen and Michael Weinhardt. I met them both last year at the conference, and they were presenting some work on kinship structure and caregiving, and I said, like, why don't we distinguish between different care contexts in Europe, and why don't we actually single out family and non-family care? They said, oh yeah, that would be an interesting thing, but we don't know the share data so well. And I said, like, well, I know the share data. I can run some models and do some calculations, and this is kind of how we ended up with this idea for one paper, or maybe two papers, or maybe three papers. So let's see how far this takes us. So this is really kind of our first shot at it. The motivation for this paper is twofold, and it both relates to two intertwined demographic processes that we've been observing in the past decades. On the one hand, it's population aging, meaning that we have an increased need for care in general, but also informal care, which has been projected to rise again. And on the other hand, increasing family diversity, which also affects individuals in their second half of life. Think, for instance, about grey divorce, think about childless older adults, as opposed to older adults that are living in multi-generational kinship structure. So the experience of family diversity and kinship structure in later life has become increasingly diverse, and that obviously has some implications for the organization of care, especially informal care, which is still heavily family-based in many European countries. Now, while we know a lot about the pathways into family-based informal caregiving, ranging from individual motivations to cultural contexts as drivers, and everything in between, from social stratification to negotiation processes between siblings, to life course factors, we know much less about non-family care. Non-family care is often just lumped together with other informal care. Rarely it's looked at separately. And I found this quite surprising, because non-family care is actually not that infrequent. Depending a bit on the country that you look at, you have a sizable share of older adults or caregivers that actually provide care or support to someone who is not a kin member, and we're with that not meaning that just like an in-law, but really a friend or a neighbor or an ex-colleague or an acquaintance. So really someone with one shares no biological or kinship ties, neither via blood or adoption or marriage, for instance. So this is surprising, and I think this is two really nice research gaps that we can fill at once with one paper. First, to look at the role of kinship structure, representing family diversity for providing non-family care. And what we'll be doing is we'll always be looking at kind of the associations with non-family care, and then kind of look at kind of side by side with family care, so that we have this comparison group, or this kind of comparison foil that we know much more about, namely the family care. And the second is this comparative evidence, where we again know a lot about on family caregiving, especially care to parents or care to spouses, for instance. So we look at the role of the care context, which we operationalize both with policy features and cultural features, especially cultural norms. I'll come to that in the methods part, where I explain a bit more how we operationalize that. So the research questions that we're trying to address in this paper are relatively straightforward, and the first one is rather descriptive, namely just asking about individuals' embedment in kinship structures in later life is associated with care provision to family members and non-family persons. So we always have these two outcomes, and how these associations vary between care contexts with their different old age care policies and care norms. I'll try to be a bit more brief on the theoretical background so that we have enough time for the empirical part. Also, I have to say the theoretical background is maybe what is least fleshed out. So here we still have some work to do. Also think a bit more about the mechanism. And here I would also be curious to hear what are your ideas or your spontaneous associations when you hear about our ideas, how we put that together. So at the individual level, we're starting with this informal caregiver model that has been put forward by two Dutch researchers about 10 years ago. And what I really like about this motive is that it says like there can be a variety of reasons why people care for someone, but very broadly, we can actually distinguish them into kind of two broader sets of motives. One is more like exogenous, so that have to motives is how they call them. So that can be normative expectations that are rooted in a family culture, in a given country context, or a given ethnic group. It can be perceived obligations that might be explicitly or implicitly communicated to me. So for instance, via parents' wishes that they say like, I want my children to look after me and not put me in a care home, for instance. But it can also be structural factors, such as, for instance, a lack of financial resources to purchase care, or, for instance, the lack of other kinship relations to look after that person, so that the single one person that is still in the kinship network, that is still kind of healthy enough to provide the care, is then ending up doing that care. So taken together, we could assume that all these motivations are leading to less voluntary pathways into caregiving, and that often concerns family care, especially care to spouses and care to parents. Like on the other side, we have the want-to motives, which are often explained with, for instance, caring out of affection because you like someone or because you like to spend time with these people. So if we look, for instance, into the qualitative literature on spousal caregiving, which is quite rich, I would say, we often find these tropes of people saying like, yeah, it just felt natural to care for my partner because I don't know how long we still have together and I like spending time with that person. So this affective component that comes with this close kinship tie is one of these motivations. Another could be that I'm endorsing care norms, so that I know that in my society it's seen well to that if, for instance, children look after their parents or spouses are there for one another. Think about the marriage vow in good times and in bad times. And people agree with these norms. They really internalize them and think like, yes, actually that's the right thing to do. I should do it as well. So there is a little bit this mix between how much is that culturally infused, but nevertheless, the want-to motives should be leading to a much greater voluntariness in the pathway into caregiving, because people can choose whether they want to do that or not. And that might actually benefit both family or non-family care receivers. Now, how does that map onto kinship structure? Because I said we're looking at family diversity and we're interested in the different kinship structures that older adults are integrated in these days. With regard to kinship structure, we can assume that if older individuals have the presence of close kinship ties, and here we're going to focus on partners and children, there are other kinship ties that we could also consider. While we're not considering them, I'll come to that. We could assume that as long as these kinship ties are present, the have-to motivations should be more salient, because there might be more demand or potential demand. So people can also anticipate that there might be caregiving demands communicated towards them. So if this family care is anticipated, it might also be prioritized, and that might suppress non-family caregiving. So if I know that I still have my parents and I still have my spouse and they might also require care from me, you might not be helping that neighbor that needs help. On the other hand, if we have no kinship ties, no close kinship ties, or only partial kinship ties, that might also free up resources and time and dedication of thought of whom else you might want to help. And then you might be ending up helping someone that you like or that you would like to support. That might also be voluntary motives, such as I'm retired, I have a lot of time, I want to do something good for society, and there is this older neighbor that needs help. Why don't I go and help that person every once in a while? So the partial or non-presence of close kinship ties might actually enable non-family caregiving by freeing up resources and not suppressing the want-to motives. So now we have to locate that into the care context, because I said we're also interested in how that maps out on different contextual features. And with regard to care contexts, probably many people first think of something like welfare regimes, where we see that old age care policies are often fitting quite nicely into the welfare regimes with their logics of decommodification or commodification, defamilization, familization. So they're often having varying degrees, but that's not the end of the story, because the provision of or the organization of care in welfare states in Europe is extremely complex, and sometimes we're having like several principles or streams that overlap each other and can sometimes even be contradictory. So for instance, we've seen an increasing push to marketization of care in universal welfare states such as Sweden, for instance. Or we see that other states that are relatively familialistic have seen a rise of subsidies for formal care services, the so-called care in kind. So that's kind of when the state is providing the care services or financing the care services in more conservative regimes, such as Germany. Or we see, like, kind of alongside these two trends, an incentivization of family caregiving through, for instance, care leaves or cash transfers. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these kind of broader containers of kind of in-kind services and cash services. We're at the moment not focusing on marketization or how the cash services are brought about specifically, but that would also be something to explore. And what we can assume is that even though there is this mix of different policies in place within a single country, often there is a certain predominance, either because it's just historically rooted or because it's culturally adaptable to the prevalent beliefs and norms in a given society. So the predominant policy should nevertheless shape the motivations, in the sense that if there are a lot of services, that might decrease the have-to motivations, because you can then pick whether you want to provide the care or leave it over to the state. And that's then again might actually fuel again want-to motivation and open up possibilities for non-family care. And for cash transfers, it should just be the reverse. So if it's expected to care and if it's even financially remunerated, it's probably harder to escape family caregiving. And then we have the cultural foundations of care, and here we're tying kind of the bow nicely back to Frau Effinger, who has always been saying that care policies and work-family regimes are always cultural, especially gender cultures. So here the question is really about who is primarily responsible for providing the care. Is it the family or is it the state? And then within the family, there is still the question what family roles are more or less linked with care provision and care obligations. For instance, who should be caring, or maybe who should be financing care, but not necessarily engaging themselves in care. And that's kind of the richness and the variety of aspects that we're going to explore in this paper. And here too, we could say that they might be interacting with individual motivations, in the sense that prevailing norm can strengthen these motivations. So think about if we have a strong state care norm, that might actually promote the voluntariness of caregiving, in the sense that you want to do something good for society, the state is allowing you to do so because you don't have these obligations. All right, let's now just very quickly have a look at the conceptual model. So essentially what we're trying to do is we try to predict, oh no, that doesn't show. Okay, I wanted to start the laser pointer, but doesn't want to show. Okay, never mind. So what we want to do is we want to predict the provision of family and non-family care. We predict it with the kinship structure, looking at partners and children. We adjust for confounding factors that are just adjusted for in the models, but I'm not going to discuss their effects. And then we assume that the care context in the form of care policies and norms both directly affects care provision, but also moderates the association between kinship structure and care provision. Okay. I just did switch it on. Smart. All right. One needs to switch it on first. So we have a set of hypotheses, but I think I'm probably going to skip them. I just show you the table. So essentially what we do have is we have hypotheses on the first line, just on the relationship, the assumed relationship between the kinship structure and the two different caregiving outcomes. Essentially just what I said before, just trying to formalize it a bit more. Then we have hypotheses regarding the association between policies and care outcomes and their respective interactions with the kinship structure. So what we're assuming here is always that these associations of the policy context should be stronger for individuals with more kinship ties, because often the norms and the policies are explicitly addressing individuals in their family roles and not necessarily individuals without family roles. Think of, for instance, care leaves. They're often targeted at spouses, children, siblings, for instance, and then everyone else is excluded. And the same here with these norms. So I'm trying to, for the sake of time, I'm skipping over this so that we have a bit more time for the findings. So something about the data and the sample. I've already said it in the beginning, we're working with the share data, and I think most of you, if not all of you, have heard of them and are familiar with them. What do I need to say about it? We're not using all the waves of the share. So share is this panel of older adults in Europe that is running biannually. We're starting with wave 4, so 2011 onwards. We're using full panel waves only, meaning that we exclude the COVID interviews and the retrospective interviews accordingly. We're using all respondents age 50 plus and their eligible partners. And after list-wise deletion of missing values on our explanatory outcome and confounding variables, we're still ending up with about 260,000 observations. And each individual is on average observed about 2.5 times. And if we think about the longer time between the panel interviews, that means that we're following them for about 5 to 6 years, which is not such a bad span if we think about older adults. And we're using all the 28 countries that we have at our disposal. Okay, so now how do we measure kind of the context level? So for the care norms, I'm trying to color code that a bit. So everything with norms will always be purple and everything with policies will always be blue. With regard to care norms, I found this really cool Eurobarometer study that was unfortunately only fielded once and never again since. And I'm hoping there will be an update on this because it had a couple of really cool items on really caregiving expectations and caregiving attitudes, very specifically with who should be caring and what do you expect when you're old, etc. We're using 5 items from it that nicely map onto the norms that we're measuring. So this state versus family and this within family relationships, who should be responsible for. And for care policies, we use the Eurostat data. We use 2 types of expenditures. On the one hand, for this old age care in cash, so that's caregiver allowances or just cash transfers to people who need care, and on the other hand, in kind, so that means expenditures for formal care services that can be either the care service itself or subsidizing the care service. And these are measured time varying, so for every year we have a value for a given country. And often these data come in the format of either the expenditures as percentage of the GDP or the expenditures per capita. And I thought that does not make so much sense, because if you have expenditures on caregiving, they don't benefit kind of the whole population with its diverse age structure equally, but they mostly go to older adults. So actually reweighted that so that we have expenditures per capita for people over 60. So that's just, I did a bit of tweaks with these official figures that we got there, and we lag them by 1 year so that we can predict the caregiving behavior with the policy structure from the year before. All right, so the measurement of the care norms, I really like these items, so I want to show that to you, advertise a bit the cool data. So these are the 5 items. We grouped them conceptually into the first 3, depicting different aspects of family care norms. So that can be obligations towards children, obligations towards relatives, but also the agreement that the state should actually incentivize family care by giving caregiver allowances. And the second bunch relates to state care norms. So that's on the one hand really this idea that the state should be responsible for providing the care either via institutional settings or via home care settings. And the second one is, even if people care for their family members themselves, they should actually be getting a respite or a relief from paid professionals that then the state should organize. So this respite care. And we can discuss whether that might not also implicitly feed into this idea that actually the family should still be the main caregivers. We can also look at the distributions of these items. I brought them with me in the appendix. So however, the Chromax Alpha looks really good on both items, so we decided to go ahead and make an index out of it. So for each individual in the Eurobarometer, we just added up how many items they agreed to, ranging from 0 to 2 or from 0 to 3, with higher numbers meaning more agreement to these different statements. And then we just aggregated these indices by country and by birth cohort, taking the mean. Why do we aggregate them by birth cohort? Because we know that individuals, depending on their year of birth, have been socialized under different circumstances, under different values and morals, and they might also have been exposed to differential streams or trends of social change, so that should actually affect the way how they think about care. And if we then think about how older adults make their decision about giving care, they're likely orienting that towards what others in their respective age groups and their country are thinking about. So kind of these peer effects. So we're trying to mimic the peer effects by doing these cohort-specific measures. The family and non-family care is measured as 2 dichotomous variables. For the family care, we are considering both care given inside and outside of the household. There is a little bit of a pitfall. Inside of the household, we only have the kind of hard physical care, and outside of the household, we also have practical help that is healthcare related, such as bringing someone to the doctor, or for instance, doing the groceries for someone who is not that mobile anymore. And these are the type of receivers that we included to define family care. And for non-family care, we're only using outside of the household. We did have some instances in share where people said that they were living together with someone that they're not biologically related to, such as I think the priest or the housekeeper. But since one doesn't really know whether there might not be some sort of an economic relationship between the caregiver and the care receiver that then just happens to kind of coincide by living together, we excluded them to be on the safe side. All right. So that's our two dichotomous dependent variables. We're estimating random effects logistic regression models on them. Yeah, the dependent variable is relatively straightforward. The independent variable is just amalgamating the presence of partner, children, both or none. We estimated 3 stages of the modeling, but actually I'm just going to show you the first model and then the third model with the interaction, because the second one is kind of getting obvious from the slopes from the interaction anyway. The controls are just our confounders that I've showed you before, and important to know because there is a little bit of overlap. Some people care for family and non-family persons at the same time. So for instance, for their spouse and the neighbor, we just control for the respective other type of caregiving in one model to make sure that our reference category are always those who don't provide any care at all. So that's just kind of a way of mimicking an analog that did not want to run through with the massive amount of data in Stata. So I just failed to run a multinomial logistic regression model here. All right, and now I think it's time for results. So first, descriptively, the prevalence of family and non-family care. Black bars are the prevalence of family care in our analytical sample. This is weighted results. And the gray bars are the prevalence of non-family care in our analytical sample. And you see that these reference lines here refer to the mean in our analytical sample. So on average, we have about 17% of our sample providing family care and about 8 to 9%, I think I rounded it up to 9%, providing non-family care. So on average, you could say we have twice as many family caregivers as non-family caregivers. But still, that means in reverse that 1/3 of older adults providing care provides it to a non-family member, which is a massive number in my eyes. We also see that this is also nicely correlated with the presence of kinship ties. So on the top group, we have no close kinship ties. On the bottom group, we have both close kinship ties. And here we really see that the gaps are getting really big. And here they're a bit closer together. So we see this clear gradient. The more family ties are present, the more family care we observe. The gradient in the other direction is not so clear. What really seems to matter here is the presence of a partner. If someone still has a partner, they're providing less non-family care, and that might point to these anticipation effects that, like, if your partner is still alive, you might be anticipating that you might need to care for them or help them in a few years from now, and then you might not be engaging in other helping arrangements so much. So that might also be strategic. And now we do the same thing, just in the random effects logistic regression models. Using all the controls, so the patterns are relatively similar, so not so much changes as opposed to just looking like kind of descriptively at the surface. To go back to our hypotheses, I said like we would expect that kind of we have these extreme ends of all family ties versus no family ties, and no family ties would enable non-family caregiving, and all family ties would suppress non-family caregiving. So according to our hypotheses, we should be expecting that all the dark plots should be on the left-hand side of the zero line, and all the light plots should be on the right-hand side of the zero line, because departing from the presence of partner and children, we would just see a divergence into the extremes, right, towards the non-presence. We find this pattern in a limited way for non-family care. So here we really see that the less family ties you have, the more likely you actually are to provide non-family care. But we also see that it's not like perfectly linear, so it really depends on who is there from your family structure. Is it the kids or is it the partner? But we don't really see like such a clear gradient for family care. So there it again really seems to depend on whether you have kids or a partner that you engage more or less in family care. And then we have this like super weird group here. So if you don't have a partner but you have kids, you provide even more family care than when you have both. The question is, where does that come from? I have no idea, but it's significant, and it really sticks out. So I think with regard to the first hypothesis, we can we can agree that these differences are relatively large. They're mostly playing out between the two extreme ends, and that holds for non-family care, but it does not hold for family care, where we have these more mixed patterns, and it really more seems to depend on who is there in your kinship network. Is it a partner or is it kids? Then in the next step, we come to the interaction between the care context and the kinship structure. And here I try to kind of group that a bit. It's going to be 4 slides and 4 more figures. So it's going to be complex, but I hope I can walk you through it in a more or less intuitive way. So we're going to start off with the effective care policies. And I'm always going to show you on the left-hand side, from your side, the left-hand side, cash for care expenditures, on the right-hand side, care in kind expenditures. So cash transfers versus services. So that's how we're going through. And then we first look at non-family care, and then in the next slide we keep the same setup and we're looking at family care. And then we switch over to care norms, where we look at family norms on the left-hand side and state care norms on the right-hand side, such as using these aggregated indices that I've shown you. And again, starting with non-family care and then moving over to family care. So try to keep it a bit color-coded and structured. All right, so starting off with policy expenditures and non-family care, the first thing we notice is we have upward pointing slopes, which is only in part in line with our hypothesis, because we would have expected that there is some crowding out going on. So with higher expenditures for cash transfers, we would have expected less non-family care, because the non-family care should be crowded out, because the focus should be lying on the family, which is incentivized. But that's not what's happening here. So these hypotheses don't hold. With regard to expenditures for formal care, on the other hand, we would have expected that it crowds in non-family care, because the kind of basic need of care should be provided by the state. The higher the expenditures here, especially in the extreme countries, so here we're talking about the Nordics, and this is what we actually find, so we can confirm that. But the overall pattern is really one of crowding in. To those of you who are a bit familiar with the comparative care literature are probably not surprised at all, because this crowding in pattern is a relatively stable one. It says just that if the state organizes the care, people do other stuff. They do the kind of colloquial stuff, they do the conversational stuff, they help in the garden, they maybe take an older relative to the cinema, to the theater, they take them out for lunch, they just spend time and talk to them and be there and give emotional support. So that doesn't mean that they do nothing, they just do different stuff. And this is more or less what we observe here as well. The same pattern with crowding in also holds for family care. Now, while this was expected on the left-hand side, think of cash transfers, caregiving leaves, for instance, that should incentivize family care. So here we see that our hypotheses are confirmed. And they're also confirmed with regard to the idea that individuals with close family ties should actually react more strongly to these incentives. Makes kind of sense because they're targeted to them. We also find this crowding in here for expenditures for formal care, which is not what we would have expected. But again, this is the same pattern of crowding in. So the overarching pattern here is we find this incentivization as expected. So if the state invests more in cash transfers, more family caregiving will be taking place, but we at the same time also find this crowding in. All right, in the next step, we're looking, or actually the last step, we're looking at care norms. So again, same picture, we mirror it. On the left-hand side, we have family norms. On the right-hand side, we have state care norms, and we would have assumed that strong family norms suppress non-family caregiving because they emphasize on a focus on family solidarity. On the right-hand side, on the other hand, we would have expected that greater state care norms actually relieve individuals from the burden to care for their family members, and that might be opening up opportunities, but also kind of promoting a culture of societal solidarity and voluntarism that then enables, for instance, helping your neighbor. And this is what we find. So hypothesis confirmed, finally. We do find some hypotheses confirmed. So we're not completely off with our predictions, but we were a bit more off with regard to the policy features. However, again, we don't really find that this should be more stronger to individuals with close family ties, because we see that the slopes are much less steep here, and the steepest slopes are here again found for individuals without any close family ties. So that's a really interesting question. Why do people without a partner and children react so much more strongly to these norms? I find that an interesting question. There might be some selectivity going on though. So the overall overarching pattern, I think that we can say, is that family norms might promote family solidarity, while state care norms, or this idea that the state should be responsible primarily for providing care, then should promote societal solidarity. Now, if we look at family care, we could assume that kind of these two slopes should just be kind of flipped and the other way around, but what actually happens is it just mirrors the picture from what we've seen before. So going down on the left-hand side, going up on the right-hand side, and that also happens for family care. So despite this idea of incentivization and putting an emphasis on family solidarity, what we find here on the left-hand side is that if the family care norm is stronger, we don't necessarily observe a higher prevalence of individuals saying they care for a family member, but actually a lower prevalence. And one explanation for this pattern could be that if the family care norm is really strong, it could be that there is just specialization. So if the care demand is so heavy that just one person does it and the rest of the kinship network maybe says like, is maybe economically rational and says like, okay, someone needs to go and work and kind of provide for these two people who cannot work obviously themselves, one because they need care and the other because they need to give the care. So there could also be some family negotiations behind this. So this would more explain a pattern of kind of specialization within the family. We find here tentative support for the idea that family members react a bit more strongly than individuals without kinship ties, but this is actually not significant at the conventional level. So I put this kind of tentatively in brackets. And on the other hand, here we again see that a strong state care norms also can actually fuel voluntary caregiving and also slightly increases the prevalence of family care. So by and large, I think the patterns are across the board really similar because whatever we plug in as a measure on the right-hand side, the slopes always go up. Be it more expenditures for formal care services or a greater agreement in the society that the state should care, we always see that. If that is the case, individuals care more, regardless of whether it's family members or not. And I think that is a really interesting pattern that deserves some discussion, which leads me to the discussion for the last 2 minutes. So quick summary of our main findings: about 1 in 5 provide family care, about 1 in 11 provides non-family care, which makes family care still twice as more prevalent as non-family care, but also means that non-family care is a really big deal because it's there and about 1 in 3 caregivers provides to a non-family member. Complete kinship structures actually seem to strengthen the have-to motive and suppress the want-to motives, as we've seen in the distribution across the different kinship ties. However, the pattern is not perfect, and the specific outlier that we found specifically in the descriptives, but also in the multivariate model, is that individuals who only have a partner but no kids seem to anticipate greater care need, and that might hinder them from taking up non-family care. The expenditures, both in cash and in kind, were associated with a greater likelihood of family and non-family caregiving, which speaks for a pattern of crowding in, not crowding out. And finally, family care norms did suppress non-family care, but state care norms always enabled any type of caregiving, both family and non-family caregiving. So what we see is something between the lines of specialization if family norms are really strong. So that means that the care burden is shifted onto one person that is then providing family care, versus a general pattern of promoting societal solidarity and maybe creating or cultivating a culture of voluntarism that leads to more people helping someone that is not necessarily related to them biologically. And the patterns, and I think this is really what keeps me up a bit, are strikingly similar for family and non-family care. So I would have expected more divergence in the patterns, but the patterns seem to be quite similar. And I think that opens up a lot of avenue for discussion. So maybe the limitations that you want to throw at me as criticism, I've thought about them already, so I'm not saying too much on it. But what I want to say is that we're still kind of thinking of next steps and an outlook. That might also be a second paper. So for instance, expand a bit on the family diversity, like what about parents, siblings? So parents are unfortunately not very present in SHARE because the sample is so old. So only about 20% still have one parent alive, and they're quite selective, so we're just controlling for the presence of parent, but we didn't really build that into the kinship structure yet. Then I think for the non-family receivers, we should distinguish them by the type of relationship. That would be really interesting. We'll have to see how far the case numbers are carrying us there. And then we should definitely also look into these different types of caregiver allowance policies. So maybe more like having some sort of a quantitative component analysis, or we're actually building a database with a qualitative typology, or trying to figure out kind of how is caregiver allowance or care leaves, how are they structured in different countries, like who is eligible, how much money can you get for it, are you socially insured, is there pension insurance, how long can you take it, etc. So we're trying to work on that, but we're still working on this qualitative database, but that might be a next step to actually use that and also kind of route that into the models. All right, and I think I'll stop here, and thank you for your attention, and curious for your questions.